Sarah Martinez adjusted the collar of her navy blue dress as she walked through the gates of camp. The California sun beat down mercilessly on the sprawling military base, and she could already feel beads of perspiration forming along her hairline. She wasn't supposed to be nervous, but her hands trembled slightly as she clutched the invitation that had arrived 3 weeks earlier. The invitation was addressed to her late brother's family, requesting their presence at a special ceremony honoring fallen Marines from the 2nd Battalion, 8th Marine Regiment. Had been gone for 2 years now, killed by an improvised explosive device in Afghanistan during what was supposed to be his final deployment. Sarah had volunteered to represent the family since her parents couldn't bear to attend another military ceremony. As she made her way toward the designated area, Sarah caught sight of rows of perfectly aligned chairs facing a small stage decorated with American flags and Marine Corps banners. Family members were already taking their seats, many clutching folded flags or photographs of their loved ones. The weight of collective grief hung heavy in the warm afternoon air. Sarah found an empty seat in the 3rd row and settled in, trying to ignore the curious glances from other attendees. She knew she looked out of place among the military families with her artistic appearance and visible tattoos. Her left arm bore an intricate sleeve design that told the story of her brother's service, carefully crafted by one of the best tattoo artists in San. The centerpiece of the design was a detailed rendering of dog tags intertwined with desert roses, the state flower of their childhood home in New Mexico. Below that, coordinates marking the location where he had fallen were inscribed in delicate script. The entire piece was framed by Marine Corps emblems and quotes from letters he had sent home during his deployments. Sarah had spent months planning and saving for the tattoo, wanting to honor her brother in a way that felt authentic to who she was as an artist and sister. Her family had initially been skeptical, viewing tattoos as inappropriate, but when they saw the finished work, even her conservative mother had shed tears at its beauty and meaning. Now, sitting among strangers who shared her loss, Sarah felt self-conscious about the exposed artwork on her arm. She considered reaching for the light cardigan she had brought, but the heat was already becoming unbearable. Instead, she focused on the program in her hands, reading about the various awards and recognitions that would be presented during the ceremony. The sound of marching footsteps drew her attention to the front of the gathering area. A formation of Marines in their dress blue uniforms was approaching, their movements synchronized with military precision. The sight took Sarah's breath away, reminding her of during his brief visits home when he would wear his dress blues to formal family events. As the Marines took their positions, Sarah noticed one officer in particular. He stood slightly apart from the others, his posture radiating both authority and compassion. His uniform was immaculate, with ribbons and medals that spoke of distinguished service. There was something about his presence that commanded respect without seeming intimidating. The officer began scanning the crowd, his eyes moving systematically across the rows of seated family members. Sarah assumed he was checking to ensure everyone was properly seated before the ceremony began. She shifted in her chair, suddenly aware of how the afternoon sun was highlighting the colors in her tattoo. As the officer's gaze continued across the audience, Sarah found herself studying his face. He appeared to be in his early 30s, with dark hair cut in the regulation military style and intelligent brown eyes. There was a gravity to his expression that suggested he understood the weight of the ceremony he was about to oversee. The background noise of conversations and settling chairs gradually quieted as more attendees recognized that the formal portion of the event was about to begin. Sarah took a deep breath, preparing herself emotionally for what she knew would be a difficult but important tribute to her brother and the other fallen Marines being honored. She glanced around at the other family members, noting the mix of pride and sorrow on their faces. Some clutched tissues, while others sat with stoic determination. An elderly couple in the front row held hands tightly, the woman's shoulders shaking with barely contained emotion. The afternoon breeze carried the scent of eucalyptus trees that lined the ceremony area, mixing with the distant sounds of military training exercises taking place elsewhere on the massive base. Sarah tried to center herself in the present moment, knowing that would have wanted her to be strong and honor his memory with dignity. As she waited for the ceremony to officially begin, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. After his death, she had struggled with anger and grief, eventually finding solace in her art. The tattoo had been part of her healing process, a way to keep her brother's memory alive while creating something beautiful from her pain. The officer at the front of the ceremony area was now speaking quietly with other military personnel, making final preparations for the formal program. Sarah couldn't hear his words, but his demeanor suggested someone who took his responsibilities seriously and cared deeply about honoring the fallen Marines appropriately. A military chaplain approached the podium, and conversations throughout the gathering area gradually ceased. Sarah straightened in her chair, clasping her hands in her lap as she prepared to listen to words of remembrance and honor for her beloved brother and his fellow Marines who had made the ultimate sacrifice for their country. Captain James Harrison stepped forward as the chaplain concluded the opening prayer, his polished dress shoes clicking against the concrete as he moved to address the gathered families. He had overseen dozens of these ceremonies during his 8 years of service, but each one still affected him deeply. Today felt particularly significant because several of the Marines being honored had served under his command during their deployment to Afghanistan. As he approached the podium, James allowed his eyes to sweep across the audience one final time before beginning his remarks. He had learned that making eye contact with family members during these ceremonies helped convey the genuine respect and gratitude that words alone could not express. His gaze moved methodically from row to row, acknowledging the sacrifice that each family had endured. When his eyes reached the third row, James found himself looking at a young woman with long, dark hair who sat alone among the other families. What caught his attention initially was not her striking appearance, but the elaborate tattoo that decorated her left arm. Even from his position at the front, he could see the intricate detail work and the obvious military themes woven throughout the design. James continued his visual sweep of the audience, but found his attention drawn back to the woman with the tattoo. There was something about the artwork that seemed familiar, though he couldn't immediately place why. As he began his prepared remarks about service and sacrifice, part of his mind remained focused on trying to understand what he had seen. The ceremony proceeded with the presentation of various awards and the reading of citations for valor. Family members were called forward to receive bronze stars, purple hearts, and other decorations that their loved ones had earned through their service and sacrifice. James watched with deep respect as parents, spouses, and siblings accepted these honors on behalf of Marines who would never come home. During a brief pause in the formal program, James allowed himself another glance toward the woman in the third row. The afternoon sun had shifted slightly, providing better illumination of her tattoo, and suddenly James felt his breath catch in his throat. The centerpiece of the design appeared to be a pair of dog tags, and even from his distance, the name etched into them looked remarkably familiar. James tried to maintain his composure as the ceremony continued, but his mind was racing. The dog tags in the tattoo bore a striking resemblance to those worn by Lance Corporal Martinez, a Marine who had served under James's command and who had been killed 2 years earlier during what should have been a routine patrol. Had been one of James's most dedicated Marines, always volunteering for difficult assignments and maintaining unwavering loyalty to his fellow soldiers. The memory of death still haunted James. He had been the officer responsible for writing the letter to his family, explaining the circumstances of their son's death and expressing the gratitude of a nation for his service. James remembered struggling with the inadequacy of words to convey the loss of such a remarkable young man. As the ceremony progressed, James found it increasingly difficult to focus on his duties. He kept stealing glances at the tattoo, trying to confirm what he thought he was seeing. The coordinates visible in the lower portion of the design looked remarkably similar to the location where had fallen, details that would only be known to someone with intimate knowledge of that tragic day. When the time came for families to place flowers at the memorial wall, James watched as the woman with the tattoo stood and walked forward with quiet dignity. She carried a single white rose, and as she approached the wall, James could see tears streaming down her face. She paused at a specific section of the wall, reaching out to touch one of the engraved names with trembling fingers. From his position, James could see that she was touching the engraved name of Lance Corporal Martinez. The realization hit him like a physical blow, confirming what he had begun to suspect. This woman was connected to, most likely a family member, and the tattoo on her arm was a tribute to the Marine James had known and respected. James felt a surge of emotion that threatened to overwhelm his professional composure. Had often spoken about his family during quiet moments between missions, particularly about a sister who was an artist and who worried constantly about his safety. He had described her as creative and independent, someone who saw the world differently than most people but who loved her family fiercely. As the woman returned to her seat, James noticed that she avoided eye contact with the other attendees, clearly struggling with her emotions. He felt an overwhelming urge to approach her, to share his memories of, and to tell her how much her brother had meant to the Marines he had served alongside. But protocol and the ongoing ceremony prevented him from leaving his position. The formal program concluded with the playing of taps, the haunting melody echoing across the ceremony area as family members stood in silent tribute to their fallen loved ones. James maintained his military bearing throughout the performance, but inside he was fighting his own battle with grief and the unexpected connection he had discovered. As the last note faded away and family members began to disperse, James watched the woman with the tattoo gathering her belongings. She moved slowly, as if reluctant to leave this place of remembrance. Several other families approached the memorial wall for private moments with their loved ones' names, but she remained seated, staring at the engraved stone from her chair. James knew he had to make a decision quickly. Military protocol suggested that he should remain available to speak with any families who approached him, but something deeper was compelling him to seek out this woman who had honored in such a personal and beautiful way. He had carried the weight of death for 2 years, and seeing his sister's tribute had awakened emotions he thought he had successfully buried. Taking a deep breath, James made his choice. He stepped away from the podium and began walking toward the third row of chairs, his heart pounding as he approached the woman who had memorialized one of his Marines in permanent ink. He wasn't sure what he would say, but he knew that this unexpected encounter was too significant to ignore. As he drew closer, James could see the tattoo in greater detail, confirming every suspicion he had harbored during the ceremony. The artwork was extraordinary in its detail and obvious emotional significance. Dog tags were rendered with perfect accuracy, down to the specific font used for military identification. The desert roses were painted in watercolor-like strokes that seemed to flow naturally around the more rigid military elements of the design. Sarah felt someone approaching from behind and turned to see the Marine captain she had noticed earlier walking directly toward her. Her first instinct was to pull down her sleeve or reach for her cardigan, assuming he was going to ask her to cover her tattoo. She had experienced disapproving looks from military personnel before when attending events related to service. But as Captain Harrison drew closer, Sarah noticed something unexpected in his expression. Rather than disapproval or judgment, his face showed a mixture of recognition and what appeared to be deep emotional conflict. He stopped a respectful distance away, his hands clasped behind his back in a formal military posture. "Excuse me, miss," he said, his voice carefully controlled but carrying an undertone of suppressed emotion. "I apologize for interrupting your private moment, but I couldn't help but notice your tattoo during the ceremony. If you don't mind me asking, are you related to Lance Corporal Martinez?" Sarah's heart skipped a beat at hearing her brother's name spoken by this stranger. She looked up at the captain, trying to read his intentions. His question was respectful, but there was something in his eyes that suggested this was more than casual curiosity. "Was my brother," she replied cautiously, instinctively crossing her arms to partially obscure the tattoo. "Did you know him?" Captain Harrison's carefully maintained composure faltered for just a moment, and Sarah saw a flash of pain cross his features before he regained control. He took a small step closer, his voice dropping to a more personal tone. "Lance Corporal Martinez served under my command during his final deployment," he said. "I was his commanding officer when he was killed. I've thought about your brother every day for the past 2 years." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She stared at this man who had been present during the most tragic day of her family's life, trying to process the unexpected connection. She had imagined meeting someone who knew during his final months, but had never expected it to happen this way. "You were there," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the background noise of other families still gathered around the memorial wall. James nodded slowly, his professional bearing giving way to genuine human emotion. "I was the one who wrote the letter to your family. I've regretted every day that words felt so inadequate to express what an exceptional Marine your brother was." Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes as she looked at this man who had shared final weeks. For 2 years, She had wondered about the people who had been with her brother during his last deployment, imagining them as faceless figures in her mind. Now she was confronting the reality of someone who had actually known as a person, not just as a name on a casualty report. "The coordinates in your tattoo," James continued, his voice growing thick with emotion. "I recognize them. I was the one who called in the position when we found him." Sarah's hand moved unconsciously to cover that portion of her tattoo, overwhelmed by the realization that this stranger had intimate knowledge of the most painful details of her brother's death. She had included those coordinates as a way to honor the specific place where it had fallen, never imagining she would meet someone who had actually been there. "I can't believe this is happening," she said, shaking her head in amazement. "Of all the people here today, of all the ceremonies I could have attended." James looked around at the dispersing crowd, then back at Sarah. "Would you be willing to talk somewhere more private? I have so many things I've wanted to tell's family, but I never knew how to reach out appropriately." Sarah hesitated, still processing the surreal nature of their meeting. Part of her was eager to learn more about's final months, while another part was terrified of hearing details that might be too painful to bear. But looking at Captain Harrison's sincere expression, she sensed that he was struggling with his own need to share memories of her brother. "There's a quiet courtyard near the base chapel," she said finally. "We could walk there if you have time." As they made their way across the base, James found himself studying Sarah more carefully. Now that he knew she was sister, he could see the family resemblance in their facial structure and the determined way she carried herself. Had possessed that same quiet strength, the ability to remain calm under pressure while still showing deep compassion for others. "Talked about you often," James said as they walked. "He mentioned that you were an artist and he was incredibly proud of your work. He carried photos of some of your paintings in his wallet." Sarah stopped walking, surprised by this revelation. "He never told me that when he called home." "Your brother was modest about a lot of things," James replied with a sad smile. "But he loved showing off those pictures to the other Marines. He said you had a gift for seeing beauty in places where other people only saw problems." They reached the courtyard, a peaceful space surrounded by palm trees and flowering bushes. A few stone benches provided seating areas for quiet reflection. Sarah chose a bench in the shade, grateful to be away from the intensity of the ceremony area. "I need you to know something," James said as they sat down. "Died trying to help others. He saw that one of our vehicles had hit an IED, and he immediately ran toward the explosion to provide aid to the wounded Marines inside. He was killed by a secondary device, but his actions allowed us to evacuate 3 seriously injured Marines who are alive today because of his courage." Sarah closed her eyes, absorbing this information about her brother's final moments. Her family had been told that died in an explosion, but they had never received specific details about the circumstances. Hearing that he had died while trying to save others felt both devastating and completely consistent with the brother she had known. "The Marine Corps awarded him a Bronze Star with Valor for his actions that day," James continued. "But beyond the official recognition, I want you to understand that your brother's character defined him as much as his courage. He was the Marine that others looked up to, someone who could find humor in the worst situations while never losing sight of his responsibilities." Sarah opened her eyes and looked at James, seeing the genuine admiration and respect he felt for. "Thank you for telling me this. My family has struggled with not knowing exactly what happened." "Also asked me to make him a promise," James said, his voice becoming more hesitant. "If anything happened to him, he wanted to make sure his family knew that he died doing what he believed was right, protecting his fellow Marines and serving his country with honor. He specifically mentioned wanting his sister to know that her artistic spirit had taught him to appreciate beauty even in difficult places." The tears that Sarah had been holding back throughout their conversation finally began to flow freely. She pressed her hands to her face, overwhelmed by the emotional weight of learning these intimate details about's final thoughts and actions. James sat quietly beside Sarah as she processed the emotional impact of his words, wanting to give her space to grieve while remaining available if she needed support. He reached into his uniform pocket and a small, weathered envelope, holding it carefully in his hands as if it contained something precious. "There's something else," he said gently. "Wrote a letter before his final patrol, which was his practice before any dangerous mission. He asked me to hold on to it and send it to his family if anything happened to him. I've carried it with me for 2 years, never knowing how to deliver it appropriately." Sarah looked up through her tears, her eyes focusing on the envelope in James's hands. She could see her brother's handwriting on the front, where he had written, "For my family, especially Sarah," in his familiar script. The sight of those words, written by knowing he might not return, took her breath away. "He specifically mentioned you by name," James continued, "and asked that you receive this letter along with something else he wanted you to have." He reached into his other pocket and produced actual dog tags, the metal worn smooth from years of wear. "He wanted you to know that your artistic vision had helped him see the world differently, even in a war zone." Sarah stared at the physical dog tags that she had so carefully recreated in her tattoo, unable to believe that she was seeing the actual items that her brother had worn during his service. The reality of holding something that had been with during his final moments felt both sacred and heartbreaking. With trembling hands, she accepted both the letter and the dog tags, feeling the weight of her brother's memory in these tangible objects. The letter was sealed, but she could feel that it contained multiple pages, suggesting that it had taken considerable time to write his final thoughts for his family. "I don't know if I'm ready to read this right now," she admitted, clutching the letter against her chest. "Would understand," James replied. He always said that the most important things in life couldn't be rushed, whether it was perfecting a military skill or creating a work of art. They sat together in comfortable silence for several minutes, the sounds of the military base continuing around them while they shared this moment of connection to memory. Sarah found herself studying Captain Harrison's face, trying to reconcile this compassionate man with her previous image of the military officers who had delivered news of her brother's death. "Can you tell me what he was like during those final months?" she asked. "My family received his phone calls, but we always felt like he was protecting us from the reality of what he was experiencing." James smiled sadly. Was protective of everyone he cared about, but he also found ways to maintain hope and humor even in the most challenging circumstances. He organized movie nights for the Marines in his unit, using a laptop and a portable projector he had bought with his own money. He said that sharing stories and laughter reminded everyone why they were fighting and what they were trying to protect back home. Sarah could picture her brother doing exactly that, always the one to bring people together and create moments of joy even during difficult times. "He organized family movie nights when we were growing up too. He said movies help people dream about possibilities beyond their current circumstances." "He also sketched constantly," James continued. Said his sister had taught him that drawing helped process emotions that were too complex for words. He filled several notebooks with drawings of the Afghan landscape, portraits of his fellow Marines, and scenes from daily life during deployment. I think he was trying to document his experiences the way an artist would. This revelation surprised Sarah more than anything else James had shared. Had never mentioned drawing in his letters or phone calls home, and she had no idea that he had developed an interest in visual art during his deployment. "He never told us about the drawings," she said. "Do you know what happened to those notebooks?" James nodded. "They're part of his personal effects that were returned to the Marine Corps. I can arrange for you to receive them if you'd like. I think seeing his artwork would help you understand how much your influence meant to him, even when you were thousands of miles apart." The thought of seeing her brother's drawings, created during his final months of life, filled Sarah with both excitement and apprehension. She knew that viewing his artwork would provide an intimate window into his experiences and emotional state during deployment, but she also recognized that it might be painful to see the war through his eyes. "I would love to see them," she said finally. "Was always interested in my art, but I never knew he was creating his own." James stood up and walked a few steps away, pulling out his cell phone to make a brief call. Sarah watched him speaking quietly with someone, presumably making arrangements for her to access personal effects. She used the time alone to study the dog tags more closely, running her fingers over the embossed letters that spelled out her brother's name and service information. When James returned, his expression indicated that he had been successful in his efforts. "I've arranged for you to visit the personal effects office tomorrow morning if you're available. They'll need to verify your identity as next of kin, but they should be able to provide you with notebooks and any other personal items that haven't already been returned to your family." Sarah nodded gratefully, amazed at how this chance encounter had already resulted in new connections to her brother's memory. "I can't thank you enough for everything you've shared with me today. Meeting you feels like a gift that's somehow arranged. Your tattoo is what made this possible, James replied. The moment I saw those dog tags and coordinates, I knew there was a connection. Would be proud of how you chose to honor his memory. The artwork is beautiful and deeply meaningful. Sarah looked down at her tattoo with new appreciation, realizing that it had served as more than just a memorial to her brother. It had acted as a bridge, connecting her to someone who had shared final months and who could provide insights into her brother's character and experiences that her family had never known. "Captain Harrison," she said, "would you be willing to meet with my parents sometime? I think they would find great comfort in hearing your stories about, and they deserve to know the details about how he died trying to help others." James nodded immediately. "I would be honored to speak with them. I've wanted to share these memories with your family for 2 years, but I never knew how to reach out appropriately. Today feels like brought us together when the time was right." As the afternoon sun began to set over camp, Sarah and James exchanged contact information and made plans for her to visit the personal effects office the following day. Sarah carefully tucked letter and dog tags into her purse, knowing that she would read his final words when she felt emotionally prepared to handle their contents. Walking back toward the parking area, Sarah reflected on the unexpected turn her day had taken. She had come to the ceremony expecting to honor his memory in solitude, never imagining that she would meet someone who could provide such intimate insights into her brother's final months. The encounter felt like a profound gift, a reminder that connections to lost loved ones could emerge in the most unexpected ways and at the most needed moments.